I'm Mark Golub. And before we look at the news, I hope all of you had a wonderful and warm Passover holiday, that your Seder or Seders were full of meaning and laughter and family. We had a very wonderful holiday at our own home. Family was in from various places around the country. We had the whole weekend together. My wife, Ruth, did a fabulous job preparing the home, making a gorgeous Seder table for some 35 people, and a terrific Seder dinner. Great brisket, Ruth. My grandson, Aaron, recited the 4 questions, and we told the Passover story, talked about what it meant to be part of the Jewish people, reliving the Exodus and Sinai. And my cousin, Dr. Michael Newman, who's a surgeon and does just amazing, heroic work with Doctors Without Borders. He was recently in Syria doing surgery at a makeshift hospital, working on both wounded rebel soldiers and Syrian soldiers, and of course on innocent civilians, some of whom were children caught in the hell of war in Syria. And Michael spoke movingly at our Seder of how we all have to work to achieve the benefits of freedom. So our Seder was really very special, and I hope all of you had a special Seder of your own, that you were with children, grandchildren, and people you love, and that it celebrated your connection to the Jewish tradition, and the Jewish people, and the state of Israel. Which brings me to what's in the news today, and it's something I simply want to talk to you about for a moment. For in the news is a Billboard campaign of a most offensive nature to anyone who cares about the state of Israel and who has any understanding of the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And from my perspective, this Billboard campaign should be offensive to any American, Jew and non-Jew alike, who has any sensitivity at all to other people, and who hopes that a rational, practical, fair, and just solution can be found to the conflict that currently plagues the Israeli and the Palestinian people. The Billboard campaign launched this week. It's a billboard that features the insidious canard that Israel is guilty of apartheid. Let's put it up on the screen, Sloan. It features the insidious canard that Israel is guilty of apartheid. And as you can see, it features a photograph suggesting, I say photograph, sort of an outline, suggesting an Israeli soldier who seems to be pointing a rifle at a Palestinian who looks like a child on bended knee. And the text reads, some of it, it's hard for you to read. I'm going to read it from the actual billboard. Americans give Israel $3 billion a year in large print. End apartheid now. Stop U.S. aid to Israel. And at the top of the ad is a quote from Desmond Tutu, who on the one hand is a South African leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize, but who's also been extremely anti-Israel. And there's a quote from 2002 that reads, "I've been very deeply distressed in my visit to the Holy Land. It reminded me so much of what happened to us black people in South Africa." And this ad campaign will now run for a month. It'll run in 25 Metro North train stations in New York, Connecticut, and then it will also run in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Francisco. Now, the ad campaign is being run by an organization known as American Muslims for Palestine. Now, I know there are people in America, good people. They may be Muslim, they may be a member of another religious or ethnic community, good people who are profoundly troubled by the pain of the Palestinian people who currently live under the control of the Israeli military. There even are people who believe that Israel has created an apartheid situation. And I probably won't be able to say anything to convince such people that they are seriously misunderstanding and mischaracterizing the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But for any of you, anyone who is open-minded, who cares about the dignity and sanctity of human life, and who cares about the integrity of all peoples, Palestinian and Israeli, something must be said about the extent to which this ad campaign is blasphemy. Blasphemy. Nothing short of hateful blasphemy. The simple facts of the current Israeli conflict is that the origin of the conflict has nothing to do with the West Bank or Israeli control of the West Bank. Nothing. Those who would suggest that Israel is guilty of apartheid are hoping that people who see their ad are either ignorant of all Middle East history or simply know nothing about history at all. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict began in the early part of the 20th century, the early part, when after World War I, the League of Nations divided the Ottoman Empire into a series of new states, virtually all of them Arab, such as Syria and Lebanon. And they also created one state meant for the Jewish people, who at the time were the victims of anti-Semitism in virtually every European, maybe every country in general. And that one Jewish state was called Palestine. And then when the League of Nations designated Palestine for the Jewish people, some Muslim leaders felt an injustice was being done, that no Zionist entity, no Jewish presence could ever have sovereignty over lands once ruled by Islam. And so in the 1930s, a plan was devised for Jews and Arabs to share the land of Palestine. In the 1930s, the Jews agreed to take a piece of Palestine and to create there a Jewish homeland. And in the 1930s, the Arabs rejected any sharing of the land. Then after World War II, after the Arabs had sided with Hitler, the successor to the League of Nations, the United Nations, voted to partition Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews accepted partition. The Arabs rejected partition. And when the State of Israel was declared on May 14th, 1948, the next day, 7 Arab nations attacked the infant State of Israel in an attempt to annihilate it. And that war never has ended. There were ceasefires, but the Arab nations have never been willing to make peace with the Jewish State of Israel. There never was an end to any battle. There's only one war. It's been fought from 1948 to this day. And no matter what Israel has done, a major part of the Arab world has refused to accept Israel's right to be. Its right to exist. The right to be is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Arabs have refused to accept the right of the Jewish people to have any piece of land, any state, anywhere in the Middle East. And so periodically, the Arab world has simply continued the one war it's been fighting against Israel since May 14th, 1948, actually May 15th, 1948. The conflict in Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael, has nothing to do about the West Bank. It's not about what's now called occupation. Many of you know of the PLO. Many of you know it stands for the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was headed by Yasser Arafat for many, many years. So here's the question. What was the PLO attempting to liberate? What was the PLO trying to liberate? Do you know? Do you remember? The American Muslims for Palestine hope you don't know and that you don't remember. Most people you speak with now assume the PLO was trying to liberate the West Bank, to free the Palestinian people from Israeli rule, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel came into control of the West Bank in 1967, during the Six-Day War, when it did its best to defend itself against an all-out war of annihilation being led by President Abdul Nasser of Egypt with the aid of Syria, and then unfortunately with the aid of the King of Jordan, whom the Israelis begged to stay out of the war. But in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel won a stunning victory in 6 days against the Egyptian and Syrian armies and against Jordan. And because of the Six-Day War, Israel came into control of the West Bank and the Sinai and the Golan Heights and Gaza. Israel did so in a defensive war that was not of Israel's making. June 1967. Israel was forced to go to war, and in that war ended up in control of lands from which it was being assaulted. And now we come back to the question, when was the PLO created in an attempt to liberate Palestine? Again, most people think the PLO was formed to liberate the West Bank, and yet the answer to the question, the PLO was formed in 1964. 1964, 3 full years before the Six-Day War of 1967, 3 full years before Israel came into control of the West Bank. The PLO was not created to liberate the West Bank. It was created in order to implement an independent Arab state of Palestine in place of the state of Israel on all of what had been Palestine and which is now called, from a Jewish perspective, Eretz Yisrael. This is the essence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It has nothing to do with borders or a two-state solution where one shares the land, 2 nations, 2 peoples sharing the land. The Jewish people have always been ready to share the land. The Israeli people today are prepared to share the land. And by the way, how many of you know the name, the term, the word Khartoum? Many well-meaning, educated people, educated Jews, do not know the word Khartoum, and yet is a crucial part of the story. For in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, what the American Muslims for Palestine hope you don't know or don't remember is that Israel offered to give virtually all of the land won during the Six-Day War back. The West Bank back to Jordan. And what did Israel ask in return? that the Arab world would accept Israel's right to exist and would make peace. But the Arab League gathered for a summit in Khartoum from August 29th to September 1st of 1967. And the 8 leading heads of state of the Arab nations issued their infamous declaration known ever since as the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. The Arab response to Israel's offer to give back lands won. During the Six-Day War, a defensive war Israel did not begin. The Arab answer was no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel. That is the situation Israel has faced not since 1967, but since 1947, when the UN voted for partition. It has nothing to do with apartheid. By the way, I'm assuming most of you do know what apartheid is. But I'll summarize again. Apartheid is a systematic racial discrimination of a people who live inside a community, inside a state, a polity, who are denied their rights usually by a minority in power. And South Africa was the quintessential apartheid, for it denied both citizenship, equality, it denied human dignity to part of its own people, its indigenous population, who had done nothing to deserve the treatment they were receiving. The black community of South Africa was always willing to live in peace with the white minority. All they wanted was a fair share in the collective. That's not what's happening in Israel or on the West Bank. The West Bank is not Israel to begin with. Israel has never annexed the West Bank. It is in control of the West Bank because the Palestinians refused to make peace and let Israel leave. And the Palestinians on the West Bank are not asking to live in Israel, nor are they asking to live in peace. Those Palestinians who continue to be at war with the state of Israel want Israel to disappear. They have the same mentality as the initial PLO of Yasser Arafat. They want to destroy Israel and replace Israel on all Palestinian lands. There are Arab Israelis, you know. And while they are clearly a second-class population, Arab Israelis are still full citizens. They vote. They receive social services. They sit on Israeli courts. They have a political party, members in the Israeli Knesset. And Arab Israelis can petition and do petition both lower Israeli courts as well as the Israeli Supreme Court anytime they want to bring a grievance against the state of Israel. That is remarkable. And it's often never mentioned and very often not understood even by caring, knowledgeable Jews. The Palestinians on the West Bank do not want to be part of Israel. They want an end to Israel. And the overwhelming majority of Israelis are prepared to relinquish control of the West Bank any moment a Palestinian leader is ready to live with the Jewish state in peace. Israel proved its willingness to do so in Gaza when it unilaterally withdrew all of its troops, uprooted all of the settlers, gave the settlements intact to the Arabs living in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza. And everybody knows it wound up with a Hamastan and a rain of 8,000 plus rockets and 2 wars. And Gaza is still at war with Israel. Hamas still has a charter and a living goal of destroying the state of Israel. That's not what the blacks of South Africa ever wanted. It's not what Mandela and Tutu were ever fighting for. There is no equivalency between Israel and the Palestinians and apartheid in South Africa. And it's time for people of conscience, ordinary Americans, ordinary Muslim Americans, to say enough of the anti-Israel rhetoric, of the campaign of boycotts and divestment and sanctions, the BDS campaign, the virulent anti-Semitic Billboard campaigns that are devoted to lies and distortions of the reality. And every now and then you hear about, well, there are simply 2 narratives. There's the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And when the Israeli talks about a war of independence, the Palestinian narrative is of a Nakba, of a catastrophe. I do not argue that the Palestinians do not see things differently than Israelis. Yes, they do. Yes, we do. But there's a huge difference between the narratives. They are not of equal weight. There are not only facts behind the Jewish narrative. The most important thing to understand is one narrative allows the other side to live, and one narrative does not. Whether the facts are exactly as the Jews would have it in their romantic story of revival after the Holocaust, and an invitation to any Arab living in Israel when the state was declared in 1948, an invitation for them to become members of the new state, loyal, participating members, as there are now in the state of Israel, Arab Israelis. The Palestinian narrative is there shouldn't be an Israel. One narrative negates the existence of the other. Those are not 2 equal narratives. And it's time for Jews and people of conscience to say that any time they hear the notion, well, there are 2 narratives. No, it's not there are 2 narratives. There's one narrative. The world made a decision that there will be a partition of the land and asked both peoples to live side by side and to share it. And one group said yes, and one group said worse than no. They said no, and we will destroy you. And it's interesting, there was a campaign in the subways that equated jihadists, those who would fly planes into the World Trade Center, with savages. Not only was there a general outrage on the American scene, Jews were outraged because they were afraid that in some way Muslims in general would be equated with jihadists. Where is the Muslim outrage now when Metro North is forced, and they have a disclaimer on their billboards, Metro North is forced now to run a vicious anti-Semitic campaign against the state of Israel? Where is the Muslim outrage? And every American has to know and remember the truth, the history, and be willing to speak the truth. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a human tragedy, but it could end in a moment. Anytime one side says, let's put down all weapons, Let's accept each other's right to be and to really share the land. That's the message people of goodwill should be spreading everywhere. What we want to do is live in peace. And the Israeli people are ready to do so anytime the Arab world has a leadership that is willing to say, Israel and the Arab world, the Palestinian community, will share the land. Those are my thoughts. I wanted to share them with you as we end the 2 nights of Passover Seder and begin the rest of the Chag, the rest of the holiday together. We come back on the air full steam. Tomorrow, Jewish organizations open up all over America, and I can ask others to share in discussion of this issue. I want to talk about the apology Benjamin Netanyahu offered to the state of Turkey. It is problematic from my perspective, although I think anybody can understand what motivated Israel to do so. We'll try to talk about that. But here, I've offered you my thoughts on this Billboard campaign. I'd love to know yours. Please feel free always to be in touch with me, to email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall. You see our address up on the screen, and you see my email address all the time. Please be in touch whenever you can be. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.